In this video, you will learn to determine if a number is between two other numbers. And we will work in the context of decimals as well as with fractions. So beginning with decimals, when you are determining if a number is between two other decimals, it's helpful to realize that the space between numbers can be broken down further. So when you deal with whole numbers, you can break down whole numbers down into tenths. So for example, here we see 0 to 2. All right, and then here in the middle we have 1. Now notice we broke this apart into tenths. So we have 0.1, which is 1 tenth, 0.2 is 2 tenths, 0.3 is 3 tenths, and etc. Now, once you have tenths, you can break tenths down further into 100ths. So looking here at 1.4 and 1.5, if you're looking just at that portion right here, we could, again, break this down further into hundreds. So that's what we see right here. So we see 1.4 on the left end and 1.5 on the right end. And notice we've broken it down further into tenths. So here we have 1.41, 1.42, 1.43, etc., all the way to 1.5. And it's maybe helpful to realize that these the decimals 1.4 and 1.5, you could put a 0 at the end of each of those and it would be the same thing. So we have 1.40, 1.41, 1.42, and then get to the end, we have 1.49 and then 1.50. So that is another thing we can do. And then with the hundredths, we can break this down further into thousandths. And the thousandths you can break down into 10 thousandths, and then 10 thousandths break down to 100 thousandths, and etc. So again, looking now at the 1.45 to 1.46, if we break this down further, we see that right here, where at the left end we have 1.45, and the right end we have 1.46, and we broke this down into tenths again, which would be now to the thousandths place. So, and again, the 1.45, you could put a 0 at the end. So what you have is 450 after the decimal. Then you have 1.451, 1.452, all the way to 1.459. And then we have 1.460. And you don't need to write the 0, but you could if you wanted to. So using that information, we can try to determine if a decimal is between two other decimals. So here we have some example problems to try. We have, first of all, 1.3, and you're determining if that is between 1.29 and 1.32. So this one, you have to visualize. So you have 1.29 right here, 1.32 over here. 1.3, that's the same thing as 1.30. So 1.30 is between 1.29 and 0.32, because if you look at the last two places, 29, 30, 32, that is the correct order. 1.30 would be between. So the answer to this one is yes. Now we have 1.21, and we're determining if that is between 1.10 and 1.20. So if you look just at the end here, so at the 10 and the 20, and over here we have 21, that really will give us our answer, because the question would kind of come down to is 21 between 10 and 20? And the answer is no. Next, we're asked if 1.003 is between 1.10 and 1.20. So this one would be helpful if we add zeros at the end of those numbers. So we would have the 1.003, we would have 1.10, and put another 0 at the end, and 1.20, put another 0 at the end. So looking at the last three digits, is 003 between 100 and 200? And the answer is no. 3 is not between 100 and 200. Next, we're asked if 24.9 is between 25 and 26. So this one, 24 is not between 25 and 26, so the answer is no. If it was 25 point something, then the answer would be yes. Now this would be an answer to the next question then, because we're asked is 25.09 between 25 and 26. The answer is yes, and if you don't see that, you can break this whole number down into tenths, and then the tenths down to 100ths. So basically just add zeros at the end of the 25, and then zeros at the end of the 26, and 25.09 would be in between, because looking here we have 0, 0, here we have 0, 9, and that 0, 9 comes after the 0, 0, and 25 would be before 26. So this would be between. And then lastly on this slide we have 26.3, and we are to determine if it is between 25 and 26. Well, 26.3 is bigger than 26. We need something that is smaller than 26 and bigger than 25. And so the answer to this would be no, 26.3 is not between 25 and 26. Now for this next part, we're still working with decimals, but now we're trying to fill in the blanks. So we're trying to figure out what numbers are missing with the following sequences. So this one right here, notice we have 726 after the decimal point, and then here we have 729. Well, we could have 727, 728, and then that would fill in to get us to the 1.729 at the end. So this would be 1.727, 1.728, and that would go in the middle. Next we have 32.3 on the far left and 32.33 on the far right. So we can break the 32.3 down into hundreds and basically just add a 0 at the end. So think of this as 30. So what numbers would be between 30 or 30 and 33? Well, that's going to be 31 and 32. So that is the decimal component of the number. So that those digits come after the decimal point. So the answer to fill in the gap would be 32.31 and 32.32. Next we have 0.034, two blanks, and then 0.0343. Again, it's going to be helpful if you add a 0 at the end of this. So we have 0.0340, and then the next one would be 0.0341, and then 0.0342, and the last one is 0.0343. Alright, so in my opinion, the decimals are going to be easier than working with the next part of the lesson, which is working with fractions. So with fractions, again, we can think of the space between numbers, whether it be a whole number or a fraction. We can break it down into smaller parts. So the space between whole numbers can be broken down into any number of sections. So for example, it can be broken into halves, thirds, fourths, fifths, sixths, etc. So here we see the numbers 0 through 2. So 0, 1, and 2. And notice we broke it down into halves. So in between 1 and 2, in between 0 and 1, we have 1/2 and 1.5. Now halves can be broken down further if we wanted. It can be broken down into fourths. So half of a half would be a fourth. So if we do that, we get halfway in between each of those segments we created. That gives us 1/4, and then 2/4 or 1/2, and then 3/4, and then 4/4, which is 1, 5/4, which is 1 1/4, 6/4, which is 1 1/2, 7/4, which is 1 3/4, and then 8/4 would be 2. And then we could break this down further if we wanted. The 1/4 we could break down and take half of the 4s, which would break it down into 8ths. Okay, so if you take half of each of these segments we created, we now have it broken down into 8ths. So we have 1/8, 2/8, or 1/4, 3/8, 4/8, or 1/2, 5/8, 6/8, or 3/4, then 7/8, then 8/8, which would be 1, then 9/8, 10/8, 11/8, 12/8, 13/8, 14/8, 15/8, and then 16/8 would be 2. All right, so we simplified, if possible, to get 1 1/4, 1 1/2, and 1 3/4. And we could keep breaking down further, 8ths into 16ths, 16ths into 32nds, etc. And this would also work if we started with thirds instead of with halves. So if we started with thirds, we would have half of a third, which would be a 6, then we would have 12ths, and then 24ths, etc. So next we're going to have to determine if a fraction is between two other fractions. Now it's going to be helpful if we convert one into the other. So for example here we have 1 5/8, and we're trying to determine if that's between 1 1/2 and 1 3/4. So to picture this on the number line, it will be helpful if we convert possibly the fractions to have the same denominator. All right, so looking at the 2, 4, and 8, they would all have a common denominator of 8. Right, we can easily convert 1/2 into something over 8. So 2 times 4 is 8 on the bottom, 1 times 4 is 4 on the top. So 1 1/2 would be the same thing as 1 4/8. And then 1 3/4, 3/4 you can write as 6 over 8, right? Because 4 times 2 is 8 on the bottom, so 3 times 2 would give you the 6 on the top. So is 1 5/8 between 1 4/8 and 1 6/8? Well, yes, it would be, because that would be right in the middle. So the answer is yes. Now, what about 1 6/8? Is that between 1 1/2 and 1 3/4? Well, we already said 1 1/2 is 1 4/8. 1 3/4 is 1 6/8. So is 1 6/8 between 1 4/8 and 1 6/8? Well, no, it's not between, because it is equal to 1 3/4. Is 1 6/8, same thing. So the answer is no, it's not between. And what about 1 7/8? Well, again, 1 7/8 would be over here, and we've passed 1 6/8, which is 1 3/4. It is on the other side, not between. So the answer here is no. Now we have another question. Is 4 1/2 between -4 and -5? Well, this one should be hopefully pretty obvious, because we're dealing with negative numbers here. 4 1/2 is positive. It's not even close on the number line. So the answer is no. Now what about -4 1/2? Is that between -4 and -5? So you could draw this out on a number line, but 4 1/2, just think of positive numbers, is 4 1/2 between 4 and 5. So if it's positive, then yes. Negative is going to be the same thing. Okay, same idea. So the answer for this one is yes. Now what about -5 1/2? Is it between -4 and -5? Again, we could think of these as being positive. So if you think of it as being positive, we would be able to tell very quickly that 5 1/2 is not between 4 and 5, because 5 1/2 is bigger. So same concept with the negatives. Okay, -5 1/2 is not between -4 and -5. It's going to be on the other side of -5. So the answer here would be no. Now, just like with decimals, we were trying to fill in the blanks given a sequence of sorts. We're doing the same thing now with fractions. So we're trying to figure out what number would be right in the middle of these two numbers. So again, we could find a common denominator. So 1/2 we can write as something over 8. So something over 8, that's going to be 4 over 8, because 2 times 4 is 8 on the bottom, 1 times 4 is 4 on the top. So what we have really is going to be 2 8s, a blank, and then 4 8s. So counting in order, 2 something and then 4. What's between 2 and 4? That's going to be 3. So we have 2 eighths, 3 eighths, and then 4 eighths. So 3 eighths is going to be the number in between the 2 eighths and 1/2. Now what about 1 1/2, a blank, and then 1 3/4? Again, we can find a common denominator where we create the 1/2 as something over 4. That's going to be 2 over 4, because 2 times 2 is 4 on the bottom, 1 times 2 is 2 on the top. So what we have is 1 2/4, a blank, and then 1 3/4. So this one actually, once we've done this, we need to break this down further. It's like we showed on the number line at the beginning of this portion of the lesson where we dealt with fractions. We broke down the halves into fours, the fours broke down to eighths, etc. That's what we're going to do right now. So because what number is between 2 and 3? Well, it's going to be 2 1/2, but how do you write that as a fraction? 2 1/2 over 4 doesn't really work. So what you want to do is convert these into eighths. So break the fourths down into eighths. So 2/4 is going to be 4 eighths, and then 3/4 is going to be 6 eighths. So basically multiply the top and bottom by 2 to get the 8 on the bottom. So we have 1 4 eighths, or 1 1/2, and then 1 6 eighths, or 1 3/4, and the blank in between. Well, what's between 4 eighths and 6 eighths? That's going to be 5 eighths, right? So our number is going to be 1 5 eighths. That is the number in between those two fractions. Next, we have one last example, and that is 1/3, and then 2 blanks, and then 2/3. Okay, so this one, we might want to start breaking this down into something smaller, because what is between 1/3 and 2/3? Well, we need to maybe convert these into 6. So if we try that, 1/3 would be 2 over 6. Right, that's the same thing. 2/3 is 4 over 6. Okay, so we have 2 6 and 4 6, but there's 2 blanks in between. So that's not going to work, because the number in between would be 3 6. Okay, but there's only one number in between, like immediately, like right in the middle. But here we have 2 blanks. So what we actually want to do is we want to try converting, instead of the thirds into 6, let's try breaking the thirds down into ninths. So the 1/3 write as something over 9, and the 2/3 as something over 9. So this would be 3 times 3 to get 9 on the bottom. 1 times 3 is 3 on the top. So that gives 3 ninths. Over here, 3 times 3 is 9 on the bottom. 2 times 3 is going to be 6 on the top. So let's try this. So we have 3 ninths, 2 blanks, and then 6 ninths. While looking at the numerators, 3, after 3 comes 4, after 4 comes 5, after 5 comes 6. So this would work, right? Because we can write 4 ninths here, 5 ninths here, and then we have 6 ninths is the same thing as 2/3. So the answer is going to be 4 ninths and 5 ninths. That's what goes on the 2 blanks. And that concludes our lesson for today. We will see you next time.